The stories. Why locals avoided that church basement after the flood. The church sat on a low rise beyond the river curve, and everyone still called it a safe hill. Neighbors said the floodwater reached the stained steps anyway, and the basement stayed damp long after the river fell. Clara Vass, 34, worked as a field insurance adjuster who took pictures, typed notes, and kept calm voices moving. She drove into the town after the levee break, aiming to document damage and close claims before tempers soured. Her goal for that day was simple: confirm a cluster of small claims tied to the hilltop church. The first change to her plan arrived when the custodian waved from the door, then refused the handshake. He gave his name as Ortis Malo, 57, a retired welder who mowed the lawn and watched the boiler. He said the sanctuary was fine, then pointed at the basement with a look people wear when a dog growls under a porch. Clara asked for access, and he said the pastor wanted meetings upstairs only. She took exterior photos, careful with angles, noting water lines marked by silt and by seeds caught on mortar. A neighbor named Nella Groft, 61, carried a crate of hymnals toward a sedan and paused to watch her. Nella said the basement had stayed locked since the flood week and that no one wanted to carry anything down there. Clara liked facts more than rumors, so she asked for invoices, damage logs, and utility records. Ortis handed over a folder with photocopied bills, each page smelling like bleach even through the plastic sleeve. The electric bill showed a high spike the week after the river fell, which struck her as odd for an empty space. When she asked for the basement key, Ortis rubbed his jaw and said the lock stuck, then said the pastor handled everything personally. She kept her voice soft, mentioned schedule pressure, then offered to meet the pastor after dinner and finish this site today. He agreed, but he kept glancing at the stairwell door like it might open on its own. Clara went to the county office and checked archived calls for emergency service, using an index the clerk let her see without fuss. The church address appeared twice during the flood days, once for a fuel smell, once for a welfare check that cleared in minutes. A dispatcher note said volunteers had stacked food in the basement for short-term storage. She returned before sunset, met the pastor near the front pews, and introduced herself with her license card. Pastor Enoch Varela, 46, wore a work shirt with rolled sleeves, and his palms looked scraped at the knuckles. He repeated that the sanctuary took no damage, then said the basement had a minor issue they were addressing privately. Clara explained her process, said transparency helped claims move faster, and asked for a basic walkthrough with photos. He agreed to a limited tour, then warned her that the air down there felt close and would not be pleasant. She took out a disposable respirator she kept for mold sites, and he nodded with relief, like that solved part of it. The key turned after a stubborn rattle, and the door opened with a smell like wet paper mixed with diesel. Steps went down into dimness that felt cooler than upstairs, and the walls showed a faint brown tide mark. Her light found a row of folding tables stacked with canned goods and boxes, all tied off with twine. Several tabletops were warped, and the legs stood at different heights because someone had shimmed them with hymnals wrapped in plastic. A generator sat to one side with a coiled cord, and the floor around it showed a clean square like a rug had been there. She photographed outlets, tagged the generator model, and asked why they needed so much power for a basement pantry. The pastor said the generator ran sump pumps for 2 nights, then stopped working from grit in the line. Ortis stood near the bottom step and rubbed the rail, his knuckles pale, like he hated the room and also belonged to it. Clara noticed a water line over the breaker box, which meant the panel had taken a hit and still looked strangely spotless. A woman appeared in the doorway, waved, and introduced herself as Paloma Cray, 32, a volunteer nurse with the food team. Paloma asked if Clara needed masking tape for labels, then added that people had slept here during the flood watch. The pastor cut in with a quick no, and Paloma closed her mouth and drifted back into shadow. Clara felt the hush that follows a correction and decided to run her questions in a sequence that built without heat. She asked about occupancy during the flood, and Pastor Varela said only supplies had been staged downstairs. She asked to see any damage to pew cushions or classrooms, and he steered her back toward the stairs with a brisk thank you. In the parking lot, a teenager skated past and kicked the curb, then said people said the basement hummed after midnight. He pointed at the brickwork view vents near the ground and said sound came out like a freezer that could talk. He grinned, then looked sorry for talking, and pushed off toward the next slot without another word. Clara sat in her car and recorded a memo into her phone, keeping the tone neutral and the timestamp obvious. She reviewed photos, zoomed on the clean square by the generator, and marked a note about missing equipment. That square looked like freezer footprint, and on a raised plan like this basement, a freezer could stay mostly dry. Her next stop was a building supply yard, where she asked the clerk for recent sales of heavy appliances paid in cash. The clerk shrugged, then said a man from the church bought a chest freezer late in the flood week and paid without a receipt. That detail qualified as a witness statement, and she typed it as such, careful not to lean on it more than it deserved. Evening pushed in, and she returned for one more look while people set up for a community meal upstairs. She asked Paloma for 5 minutes in the basement to recheck the panel labels, promising to stay out of the way. Paloma agreed, then quietly handed over a small key that looked too new for an old door, her eyes level and steady. Downstairs, the lights flickered as if a loose connection lived somewhere behind the fresh panel cover. Near the far wall, she found 2 pallets draped with tarps that had been taped several times, and the tape pulled white in places. A faint, sweet odor rode the damp smell, like fruit left in a trunk after a warm day at the lake. She lifted a corner and found case water stacked over a long trough cut into the slab, its edges chipped and sharp. A length of garden hose ran from the trough to a sill drain where floodwater had once receded, and the hose still glistened. She followed the hose with her light, stepped around the tarps, and saw the end shoved behind a dented freezer. The cord was gone, but a film of oil on the floor traced a path toward the clean square near the generator. She crouched, counted to 5 to settle her breath, then stood and walked back toward the stairs to reset her approach. On the way up, she passed Ortis as he came down, his arms full of clean towels for reasons that felt unclear. Clara asked if they had documented any salvage from the basement that could justify the electric spike. He nodded too quickly, said there had been a spill from a donated machine, and that they had cleaned it thoroughly after. She thanked him, then stepped outside and listened to a rain gutter tick as the day cooled into night. Her hotel room was quiet, and she laid the photos on the table beside the binder she kept for flood jobs. She cross-checked the electric spike days against the generator ownership dates, using calls the county clerk let her copy. A pattern formed, modest and plain, which said power ran in the basement several nights after the river pulled back. She called a friend who worked restoration and asked about standard practice for wet freezers in basements. He said most techs would drag them outside, prop the lid, and tape a sign to keep people away until haul out. He said running a generator indoors for a freezer was dangerous, and added that diesel odor with sweet tang usually meant refrigerant leaked. Clara returned at first light and found Paloma sorting donated jackets on the front steps. Paloma watched the street, then said she had worked disaster shelters before and knew that water brings out the best and worst. She said she had asked to close the basement, and that she would be happier if an outsider made decisions for them. With Paloma present, Clara requested a formal walkthrough with full photo documentation, and the pastor agreed after a long pause. He suggested they invite a town officer to keep things calm, and she agreed without hesitation since an extra witness helps. Officer Renwall, 39, arrived and signed the site log that Clara carried in her bag for exactly this moment. They opened the basement door together, and the smell rose again, edged with sourness that set teeth on edge. Wren kept a straightforward tone, said they would check for safety risks and nothing more, and the pastor nodded with his jaw set. They moved toward the far pallets, and Paloma touched Clara's elbow, then pointed with 2 fingers at the sill drain. Clara photographed the hose, the trough, and the freezer compression dents that matched a recent move across gritty floor. Wren looked at the panel and said the cover was new, then asked if an electrician had cleared it, keeping his voice even. Ortis said he would get the paperwork tomorrow, and stared at the drain like he feared what might back up through it. The twist waited in a storage closet behind a rolling chalkboard where someone had stacked plastic tubs in a neat column. Wren asked permission, lifted the lid on the top tub, and found medical waste bags tied with careful knots. The labels showed a clinic in a nearby county, and date codes matched the flood week plus 3 days after. Paloma exhaled, then said the town clinic had shut power during the worst night and that someone offered temporary cold storage here. The pastor stared at the bags and rubbed his temple, then said yes, they had tried to help and keep things under control. Ordis said the freezer had failed, they had panicked, and they had moved what they could to ice chests upstairs. Clara kept her voice in the middle as she asked whether any records accompanied the delivery of those bags. The pastor produced a photocopy from his wallet that showed a shaky agreement to secure and return the materials promptly. Wren read it twice, nodded, and said they needed to report this and arrange a proper collection, and the pastor said he understood. The pieces now fit the noise locals heard at night, the generator, and the spike in the bill after the rain. Refrigeration had kept those bags stable for a short window, then failed when the sump pumps stole too much current. The sweet tang in the air had been refrigerant, and the last trace of spoiled ice from makeshift coolers. They documented the closet, sealed the tubs again, and carried them upstairs where the air felt simple and bright. Wren radioed the county, asked for a hazmat team and the clinic contact, and kept his words plain so no one panicked. Paloma called volunteers to move the meal upstairs, and they did it quietly, like they were shifting a sleeping child. Within an hour, a small truck arrived with 2 techs who spoke carefully and signed every line Clara handed over. They packed the tubs into rigid containers and handed the pastor a receipt that settled chain of custody without drama. The tech said this sort of mix-up happens in storms when freezers are scarce, and that it becomes a cautionary tale for years. After the truck left, Clara took final photos of the basement and noted the cracked trough that had worried her from the start. She recommended a full inspection for the panel and air testing before volunteers returned to work downstairs. The pastor agreed, his voice steady now, and Ordis finally sat on the steps and let his shoulders drop like a load had slid off. The town never made a scandal of it, since nothing criminal had been intended, and the fix was clean and quick. That said, people still avoided the basement for a while, since memory can stick to concrete and walls like damp. They spoke of the humming nights as a warning, and they stored donations upstairs where anyone could see them in daylight. Clara filed the report that afternoon and drove out past fields that glittered with wet leaves pushed against fences. She felt no thrill, only quiet relief that the pieces had held together and that nothing worse had formed in secret. Her notes added a simple line that generosity without planning can rot faster than anyone expects in warm water. Later, she learned the church held a small meeting and told their members the whole sequence with plain language. They apologized to the clinic and offered money for the generator fuel that had been wasted in the failed plan. People appreciated honesty, but the basement kept its reputation because reputations have long legs when the air has smelled wrong. By autumn, the concrete was scrubbed, fans had run for weeks, and the panel wore a new sticker from an electrician. Still, a few congregants preferred folding tables upstairs, and no one minded because sunlight makes simple promises. When it rained again, the pastor stacked extra caution tape by the stairwell and kept the door locked without debate. Neighbors now say they avoided that basement not because of ghosts or whispers, but because they knew the facts. They remembered that freezers hum for reasons, and that a locked room with a sweet tang is a message rather than a mystery. The town chose to listen, and the story settled where most real stories live, halfway between relief and regret. Clara closed the file and moved on to other roofs and other high-water marks, keeping her methods the same. She asked ordinary questions in steady sequence and waded through pauses that often carried more truth than quick words. The church needed time, the town needed air, and the basement needed light, and they all eventually got what they required. Years later, the flood was referenced as a hard season, not a nightmare, and the hill stayed a safe hill again. People mentioned the humming when they taught young volunteers how to store donations and why clear logs matter most. The pastor still kept the key, but he also kept the receipt that proved the chain unbroken, which made him sleep better. Clara would sometimes pass through on other assignments and find Paloma sorting jackets on the steps with calm hands. They would wave as if nothing remarkable had happened, which felt correct because the point was that nothing worse had arrived. The basement door stayed closed unless the work demanded it, and that quiet was the final lesson worth holding. The stories. Dispatcher, who redialed a night number years later. The call that woke the overnight desk never finished cleanly, and the number that hung up stayed burned into memory. The report marked it as an incomplete welfare check request, and the audio ended right after a sharp breath. Leora Vance worked nights at a regional communications center, 36, steady voice, quick notes, routine coffee. She covered a patchwork of small towns around a river, and her goal that night was simple and ordinary. She wanted to make it through the shift with clean logs, then drive home before sunrise. At 2:43, the line flashed unknown number, and a woman whispered that somebody was on the porch. The voice cracked like cold glass, and static clipped the rest, so Leora asked the normal questions. The call died mid-sentence, and the return attempt fed a busy tone that rolled like a slow alarm. Protocol said, log it, dispatch a unit, and move forward with the map. She sent 2 cars across county lines, and she wrote porch contact unknown female, possible prowler, audio cutout. The officers found a silent street and a door light, and the porch camera showed only a moth. The address did not match the call trace, which often happened with rural switches. The closest relevant record was a break-in from 1998, and the same street used to be named differently on paper maps. The officers cleared without contact, and Leora filed it under incomplete with a notation on poor signal. She replayed the clip during the quiet hour before dawn, and she heard a faint tone behind the voice. She had a habit of catching tiny sounds people missed, and she logged them like breadcrumbs for later check. The tone matched the alert from older medical pendants, according to an equipment chart in her drawer. 2 days later, the number could not be connected, and the carrier reported a recycled pool of lines. A supervisor closed the incident, as resolved by patrol presence, and life returned to the ordinary rhythm of alarms and traffic. Leora drove home through thin drizzle and told herself to let the record settle. Years slid by with new software and different chairs, and Leora moved into training and quality checks. She taught new dispatchers to separate panic from facts and to trust logs more than late-night adrenaline. She kept a notebook of unresolved lines, a quiet ledger of what the radio called ghosts. In 2005, a county audit required purging old tapes, and Leora requested the call as a training sample. She argued that the tape showed how to verify address data when signals bounced, and the review board agreed to preserve it. She placed the audio in a folder for classroom use, then forgot it for a while. In 2017, the center switched to digital recording with automatic transcription for flagged words. The legacy folder ported into the new system, and the software saw porch and pendant, then tagged it for quality review. Leora listened again and heard the same faint tone, which still felt wrong and unfinished. She noticed a rhythm behind the static, and it repeated every 6 seconds with small variants. A trainee suggested a smoke detector chirp, but the pattern felt too mechanical for a battery warning. Leora wrote a new note, and she marked it as likely device signal not from residents. A retired technician stopped by for coffee and heard the clip through an open speaker. He said the beeping sounded like a hallway alarm from a care facility, and the pitch matched certain wall units. He gave a rough model name from years earlier, and he shrugged in that cautious way field techs learn. Witness statements in older town council minutes mentioned a small facility that closed in 2006. The building sat at the edge of a service road near the river, and the license lapsed after staff shortages. The address never showed in the dispatch mapping tool, which favored current businesses and active residences. Leora searched archived calls around that road and found short bursts from unknown lines that year. Each clip cut off before a name, and the patrol responses found nothing but chain doors and dust. A maintenance crew had watched the property for a bank, according to one officer report from spring. She pulled tax records from the county site and found a change of ownership in 2007. The building title shifted to a holding company, which often meant redevelopment, which never came. A satellite photo showed a roof with patched squares and a light pole that leaned toward the access lane. The night number from the porch call mapped to a carrier block once used inside institutions. A policy note in an old binder described internal extensions that could overflow to outbound lines when certain failsafes trip. It was not proof, but it lined up with what the technician had described over coffee. She visited the records room on her lunch and requested dispatch logs for that road after 2006. The clerk pulled a slim folder with dust, and the sheets listed trespass checks requested by neighbors. No violent incidents were recorded, and most notes referenced animals and teens daring each other. A faded memo said interior power was cut to code years ago, and alarms were disconnected with a certificate. The memo was initialed by a contractor who later moved out of state, according to a local paperclip. The paper mentioned a minor zoning fight over repurposing, which stalled and faded. A rumor in a neighborhood forum referenced late-night lights near the loading door, reportedly seen by a delivery driver. The driver claimed to hear a tone like a distant truck backup and then nothing after he blinked his high beams. The forum thread ended with jokes, and the administrator locked it after a week. Leora requested permission to run a courtesy check by phone on the legacy carrier block. She wrote that the new system showed occasional pings from inactive numbers, and she wanted to verify with the provider. The provider sent a bland letter that said non-billable pings could reflect maintenance checks, which proved little. She let it go again until 2021, when a cold storm knocked power around much of the valley. The center fielded hundreds of calls for downed lines and trees, and unknown numbers flooded the switch when cell towers failed. The old number flashed across a test screen, and a note in red tagged it as historic. It hit her in the middle of managing a pile of alarms, and she felt the odd gravity of unfinished work. Her trainee, a quiet analyst named Matteo Greer, saw her stare and asked what history followed that line. She explained the porch call, the tone, the closed facility, and the recurring pings during outages. He suggested a careful redial during low traffic hours, which fit policy when no private party would be disturbed. The number technically did not belong to a person, and the facility was listed as vacant in tax files. The watch commander noted no risk and approved a controlled test with recording flagged as training. At 3:10 the next night, Leora sat with Matteo in a side room and pressed redial on a clean console. The ring returned at a low volume, and a relay clicked before a voice picked up with a machine crawl. The voice said, "Reception desk. Please hold." The line stayed open with air and faint humming. Leora spoke carefully, and she used the generic script for a wellness verification at an inactive site. The line did not respond like normal interactive voice response, and the hum rose, then settled like heating vents. Matteo pointed to the waveform on the screen, and he traced a stair step that pulsed in threes. She said the center needed to verify status for a safety audit, and could a staff member confirm the building as empty. The voice returned with a single word, and it sounded like census, which made no sense for a desk. The hum changed to a thinner tone, and something clicked like a phone being set down. They stayed quiet, and a tiny echo carried an off-room sound that resembled elevator chimes. The building never had an elevator, according to the old permit in the zoning files, which listed 2 floors only. The chime could have been something else, or a bleed from another source through a carrier trunk. The call lasted 2 minutes, and then a hard click ended it with no final acknowledgement or goodbye. Leora logged every detail with exact time and the conditions of the room, plus the fact that a second console witnessed. She wrote that the voice felt recorded, but not like a standard system recording from that era. A next step followed policy, which said request a daytime site check with property access if possible. The sheriff office called the management company, which reported that the interior phones were long removed with certification. A maintenance vendor met deputies at noon, and the group entered through a side door with a stubborn hinge. They found clean air, paint flakes, and a smell like dry paper after long storage. No phones sat on desks, and no wiring hung from ceilings beyond bundled tubes cut and capped. A panel in the back room had a line of dead indicators, and a label from 2006 named the contractor. A back storage closet held a metal cabinet for telecom terminations, and inside a single light glowed green. The maintenance vendor said the light probably fed from a battery pack, which should have died many years earlier. He pulled the pack, and the light stayed green, which made him raise his eyebrows without a word. They traced the last live wire through conduit to a junction box near the loading door by the ramp. The box led to an old underground line that likely connected to a central office by the highway. The vendor said a ghost loop could be holding a stub signal, which might ring when jolted by storms. The explanation fit enough to calm nerves, and it gave the watch commander a line to give any curious council member. Leora filed the daytime result and waited for the routine to end, but her notebook felt heavier than before. She wanted something cleaner, a line that tied the porch call to a person. She checked archived calls for names near the facility in late 2005, and a surname appeared twice. The name belonged to a kitchen worker who reportedly stayed late to clean and who left town soon after closure. A short article from a community paper mentioned a farewell potluck in a church hall. A social post from years later showed a small photo of a medal on a refrigerator and a caption about nights that never end. The account had poor privacy settings, and it linked to a page for a caretaker group that offered mutual aid. The group had a public list of contacts, and one number matched the surname. She called during the afternoon from a staff phone and explained she was a dispatcher reviewing a historic alarm. The woman who answered identified herself as the former cook, and she said the night phones were a mess back then. She remembered plugging a line into a wall to ask for help during a snow night, then hanging up fast. The year matched the period before closure, and the memory included a porch light that never switched off correctly. The cook said a hallway alarm sometimes tripped when wind hit the wheelchairs stacked near an exit door. She said a pendant kept calling the desk after the resident moved, and staff joked about it. Leora asked if anyone had used an emergency night number taped under a desk, and the woman hesitated, then said maybe. She said an old laminated card listed a direct outside line for after hours when the main switch froze. She added that the card got lost during a water leak, and the sticker glue ruined 2 drawers. The detail matched a photo in the zoning files that showed bubbled plywood under a window near the desk. The water issue provided another path for odd faults, which could keep a line limping and ring when power fluctuated. The cook promised to look through an old box for any scraps, and she promised nothing more. Days later, an envelope arrived addressed to the center with no return, and inside lay half a laminated card. The text read, "Night number for direct line. Use only if house phones fail." The bottom showed 6 digits with 2 missing. The plastic edge was cracked, and a brown stain cut through the second line. Leora held the fragment near the recording console and felt the story settle into a shape that made sense. The porch call likely came from a staffer trying to poke through a dead switch, and the tone was the hallway alarm. The number carried forward through bureaucratic leftovers, and it rang when the storm hit the loop. She still needed the humane piece. The person whose whisper said someone was on the porch that night. She checked weather records for a cold snap that matched the reported snow night, and the timeline met the audit note. A dispatch log from the same week showed a trespass call at a different address with no contact. The officer who filed that trespass had retired to a nearby town, and he answered his landline on a sunny afternoon. He remembered a night when snow fell like ash and radios kept picking up carrier noise. He also remembered stopping near the old facility entrance, then leaving after seeing only footprints of a stray dog. He did not remember any porch lights, but he said the small homes nearby sometimes used helper bulbs that never slept. He also said staff from the facility used to walk to a bus stop at 4 in the morning after night shifts. The whisper could have been a staffer leaving alone, worried by a shape on the ramp. The theory fit and did no harm, and it honored the boundary between records and stories. Leora wrote a final entry into the training file, and she summarized the chain of evidence with careful language. She used reportedly, and dispatch logs and witness statements, and she added the laminated card as a scanned appendix. Before she closed it, she redialed the night number one last time to satisfy the part of her that wanted symmetry. The line clicked into a dead tone for 3 slow breaths, then released a single chime in silence. She sat still, then pressed stop and saved the recording with a title that matched her steady heart. She did not post about it, and she did not share more than the classroom frame. The work of nights is often this quiet, a puzzle solved just enough to let people sleep. On her drive home, she watched a porch light fade behind a tree line and let the road carry the rest away. The stories. The motel room safe with a secret ledger. The motel sat just off a 2-lane highway that curved through a stretch of desert where radio stations faded to static. The signs still buzzed faintly, a few letters missing so that it read, asterisk, Elton Mo L asterisk. For years, the rooms had been rented mostly to truckers, traveling salesmen, and people who didn't want their names on a record. But in the spring of 2011, a part-time maintenance worker named Vince Daly age 42, came across something in room 12 that would change how the place was remembered. Vince wasn't an ambitious man. He fixed air conditioners, mowed the patchy grass, and replaced broken keys. On that particular morning, he was there to remove a faulty safe from under the dresser. It had been locked for years, ever since the manager before last passed away. The new owner told him to cut it open so the space could finally be rented again. Inside was a single object, a small black ledger, its edges curled and faintly sticky, as if something had spilled on it long ago. The front cover had no name, no label, just a thumbprint stain. Vince assumed it was nothing. Maybe a guest had used it to keep receipts. He tossed it in his tool bag and went on with his work. Later that evening, curiosity got the better of him. He opened the ledger while sitting at the counter of a diner across the road. The first few pages were normal lists of initials, dates, dollar amounts, but halfway through, the tone shifted. Names were written in full, alongside words like balance cleared and returned. Some lines had stars next to them, and others were crossed out entirely. Near the back, he saw a series of entries dated between 1984 and 1987, all under a heading written in shaky block letters, asterisk asterisk collections room 12. Asterisk asterisk. At first, Vince thought it might have been a motel expense log, but a few of the names seemed familiar. One matched a woman whose picture still hung behind the front desk, a former housekeeper who disappeared decades ago. He mentioned it the next day to asterisk asterisk Marlene Greer asterisk asterisk, the daytime manager, who shrugged and said old records were full of ghost entries. Still, something in her expression told him she wasn't entirely surprised. Over the next few days, Vince couldn't let it go. He went to the county library and looked through microfilm archives of local newspapers. In late August of 1986, he found a short article about a missing motel employee named asterisk asterisk Carla Mendez asterisk asterisk. The story said she'd last been seen leaving work after a night shift, carrying the deposit bag for the week's earnings. Police assumed robbery, but no suspect was ever found. That name Carla was written 3 times in the ledger, each next to the same date. Asterisk asterisk August 22, 1986. Asterisk asterisk. One entry read, final balance, then ledger closed. The coincidence was too clean to ignore. Vince took photocopies of the pages and showed them to a retired sheriff's deputy he knew, asterisk asterisk Alton McRae, asterisk asterisk, who had worked the area back then. Alton took one look and went quiet. After a moment, he said the handwriting reminded him of asterisk asterisk Ray Weller, asterisk asterisk, the motel owner in the 80s. Weller had died in 1992 after his car went off a canyon road. No foul play suspected, just bad brakes and too much whiskey. Alton said there were rumors Weller used the motel as a front for short-term loans cash advances to locals who couldn't go through a bank. The ledger might have been his way of keeping track of who owed what. The crossed-out names, he explained, could mean debts paid. Or something worse. Vince started noticing how people reacted when he mentioned the find. Some locals would change the subject. Others told him not to dig. The place had been losing business for years, and nobody wanted reporters sniffing around. But he couldn't shake the thought that someone might still care about what happened to Carla Mendez. He tracked down her sister, asterisk asterisk Isabel asterisk asterisk, who still lived 2 towns over. When he showed her the ledger, she didn't even touch it. She just said, "We already tried for 25 years. Nobody cared then. They won't now." Before leaving, she pointed at one of the other names, asterisk asterisk P. Larkin. Asterisk asterisk. He was a regular there, she said. Used to drink with the owner. Ask the bartender from that time if he's still alive. Vince found asterisk asterisk Pete Larkin asterisk asterisk listed in a 2020 phone directory. He was living in a nursing facility about 30 miles away. When Vince called, the man's memory was fading, but one thing stuck. There was cash, Larkin said. Every weekend, people paid what they owed. Weller called it the 12 Club. Said if you didn't pay up, you checked out for good. It sounded like drunken talk, but when Vince returned to the ledger, he realized that almost all entries labeled cleared were tied to weekends. One page listed the amount 500 next to C. Mendez, and a note, asterisk asterisk, handled in 12. Asterisk asterisk. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. Carla disappeared on August 22, 1986. Weller's ledger mentioned her by name that same day. Weller died 6 years later in what might have been an accident, and now, decades later, his motel still stood, barely operating, with a safe no one had opened until Vince cut it loose. He reported everything to the local sheriff's office. They took the ledger as evidence, but nothing came of it for months. Then, in early October of 2012, a construction crew working on a new drainage ditch behind the property uncovered partial human remains. Dental records confirmed they belonged to Carla Mendez. The investigation was reopened. Forensic teams matched residue from the ledger's pages to soil found at the burial site. Both contained the same rare industrial solvent used in the motel's janitorial supplies during the 80s. It wasn't enough to convict anyone, but it closed a circle. The 12 Club wasn't a rumor. It was bookkeeping for threats carried out. By the time the motel finally shut down, Vince had long quit. He moved north, took a job maintaining cabins at a lakeside resort, and stopped talking about what he'd found. Reporters wrote short pieces calling it the Ledger case, and then it faded again into local legend. Years later, when the building was demolished, one last item turned up in the rubble, a second, safe, smaller, newer, but sealed tight. Inside, they found only a key-tagged *** room 12. Copy. ***, nothing else, no pages, no ledgers, just that key. Placed deliberately. People who'd worked there guessed Vince had planted it, a quiet nod to what he'd uncovered, but those who knew him said he wouldn't have done that. He hated attention. Maybe it was Weller's doing, a strange joke meant to outlast him. Either way, the motel's sign was gone, the ground was leveled, and the highway kept humming like nothing had ever happened. Still, sometimes at night, when the wind passes through the empty lot, locals say you can hear the faint rattle of a loose metal door like an old safe settling back into silence. Whether that's true or not hardly matters. What stayed was the story, and the proof that even the most ordinary places can keep ledgers of their own. The stories. This night guard filed a missing hours report. The file started as something routine, a timestamp discrepancy in a small-town security log. A night guard at a regional warehouse filed a missing hours report, claiming his time card didn't match the hours he'd actually worked. The report was short, oddly calm, and dated early March of 2019. No one thought much of it until he never came back to work. His name was Leon Hartridge, 43, a former truck driver who'd switched to night security after a back injury. The warehouse sat off a rural interstate, the kind of place that smells like cold concrete and diesel even after midnight. Leon's shift started at 10 and ended at 6. His wife told investigators he usually came home by 6:30, drank coffee, watched old westerns, then slept until afternoon. That pattern broke on a Wednesday night when he didn't clock out. The initial assumption was simple. Maybe he quit. Maybe he got another job, or maybe he just walked away. But the following morning, his supervisor found his lunchbox, still sealed, and a half-empty thermos on the break room counter. His reflective vest hung neatly on a hook, radio still attached. The last digital swipe of his ID was logged at 3:42 a.m., then nothing. The company filed a basic absence form, but by Friday, the sheriff's office got involved. They reviewed the overnight CCTV, 6 cameras in total. 5 worked fine. The 6th, covering the north loading dock, froze at exactly 3:41 a.m. Then, 3 minutes later, all motion detection stopped. It wasn't just a blackout. The file header showed it had been manually overwritten. Leon's brother, a retired electrician, offered to check his apartment when calls went unanswered. Inside, he found Leon's keys on the counter, wallet in the same place he always left it, and a spiral notebook on the kitchen table. The last entry, written in his blocky handwriting, read, "Clock shows 4 when I walk out. Feels later. Light's wrong color again." Investigators traced that note back to similar remarks he'd made to coworkers in the weeks before. One of them, a forklift operator named Ray Corbin, told deputies Leon had been bothered by something about the new lighting system. The company had replaced the overhead fluorescents with motion-activated LEDs that flickered under certain camera angles. He said it messed with his sense of time, Ray recalled. He'd come in thinking it was midnight and swear it was almost morning. At first, police treated the notebook as irrelevant, a tired man rambling about lights. Then came the dispatch logs. A 3:48 a.m. call had been placed from Leon's company-issued phone to a non-emergency county line. The recording still exists. He told the operator he needed to document something about the schedule. His tone was formal, detached, like he was making a statement rather than asking for help. The operator tried to clarify what he meant, but the line dropped mid-sentence. The call lasted 53 seconds. When they checked the network records, they found something else. The call didn't route through the cell tower nearest the warehouse. It bounced from a tower 30 miles east across the river. That's the same direction Leon's phone was last pinged before it went offline, near an unfinished section of the old state bypass, closed since 2011. Deputies drove out there and found fresh tire tracks in the gravel, leading toward a fenced construction lot. No vehicle was recovered. Weeks passed. Local news ran a single story: warehouse guard missing after time card dispute. Public interest faded quickly. And as fashion, local news, one of the power. But in June, the company's new HR contractor discovered something odd while auditing payroll. Leon's time card for that final night didn't just show missing hours, it showed duplicated entries. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., his ID was logged twice at two different doors, seconds apart. One swipe at the front entrance, one in the mechanical hallway. Same ID, same timestamp. Technically impossible. Investigators re-examined the internal server that housed the door logs. That's when they noticed a secondary access profile had been created using Leon's credentials, but tagged with a different department code, one belonging to the electrical maintenance division. The account was active for 1 week, then deleted. IT records listed the administrator as temporary systems testing. No one at the warehouse remembered authorizing it. The more they dug, the stranger the timeline became. Archived footage from prior nights showed brief blips in the digital clock, displays 3-second shifts where the time rolled backward before correcting itself. Leon had written about this in another note. Clock skipped again. Same moment the hum cut out. Technicians later confirmed that during those same minutes, a backup generator was cycling power for a series of sublevel fans. Only a few workers even knew the sublevels existed. They weren't active parts of the facility anymore. When authorities finally inspected the lower level, they found old offices sealed off with plastic sheeting and warning signs for asbestos. In one corner sat an unplugged time clock terminal dated 1994. The paper spool inside it still contained partial punch cards, yellowed and brittle. One of them bore Leon's employee number, printed faintly beside the name of a former contractor who died years earlier. That discovery reframed everything. Somehow, the modern ID system had merged data with the obsolete one, producing overlapping records that made it appear Leon was in two places at once. The missing hours report he'd filed wasn't about unpaid wages, it was about time itself, slipping in a way he couldn't explain. The investigators never found conclusive proof of tampering, though one retired systems tech told local reporters that the company's old mainframe still ran partial code from a discontinued scheduling program called ShiftLine. He claimed that under rare conditions, like a power cycle during data backup, it could duplicate entries with original punch data from the archive, labeling them with active credentials. If that happened when Leon's ID was scanned, it might have triggered a fatal error, but that's still theory. What's factual is this. The same Friday, the audit uncovered the duplicate entries. A highway cleanup crew reported finding a fragment of a reflective safety vest along the bypass construction route. It matched the brand issued to Leon's team. DNA analysis was inconclusive exposure, and time had degraded it, but one detail stood out. The vest's zipper pull contained traces of oil consistent with the warehouse's loading dock equipment. In the end, the case file closed under missing person, presumed deceased. Officially, no foul play. Unofficially, everyone agreed something in that building broke his sense of time before he vanished. His wife still keeps the notebook on a shelf. The last page, just beneath his final note, has a short line written in different ink, maybe added later, maybe the same night. It reads, "Clock shows 4, door says 3. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. A man noticed an inconsistency, tried to document it, and disappeared between two readings of the same minute. Whether that was error, accident, or something stranger about how those systems looped, no one can say for certain. The warehouse eventually upgraded its entire security network, scrapping every trace of the old servers. But the missing hours report still sits in the county archive, a single-page statement with the timestamp frozen at 3:42 a.m. The same moment the camera went dark. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of 3, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise? Steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind? Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47. No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norham, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard 2 different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, the call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. "The system hiccups sometimes," he said. "Let it go." Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. "You know what gets me?" he said. "He's still here." Not, "I'm still here." Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Alan managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said. But it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed-through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Alan's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments: the 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, "It was probably static." Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, "But static comes from somewhere." At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The stories. Why this motel room safe changed everything. They called it a budget motel along a long highway spur where road dust gathered in corners and secrets settled quietly. The room safe in number 12 looked ordinary enough. Powder-coated steel with a keypad that beeped politely at tired travelers. Lyle Garza woke before sunrise on a Tuesday, 38 years old, and working claims for a regional insurer. He had driven 3 hours to meet a policyholder whose pickup had burned behind the old diner, and he wanted clean paperwork today. He checked into the motel first, showered fast, then laid out forms on the dresser, careful about matching VIN digits and timestamps. His plan was simple: wrap the inspection before lunch, then circle back for photos and voice notes after the truck release. He liked driving while the day still felt open, and he told himself the assignment would be routine and forgettable. It had been forgettable until the manager knocked. 2 quick raps, then a pause heavy enough to make him frown. Mara Quintero stood in the doorway with a clipboard, 34, managing rooms and payroll while raising her nephew after school. She asked if he had heard the beeps from the safe, because front desk saw brief power spikes last night. Lyle said he had not used the safe, and she nodded, eyes moving toward the keypad like someone checking a stove twice. Maintenance had logged an odd complaint the previous afternoon. Reportedly, a guest in 12 claimed the safe ate his wallet. The man left before checkout, promising to call the card companies, and a note in the margin said possible intoxication. Mara said housekeeping later pulled the bedding and found a small metal tool near the baseboard. Lyle picked up the tool carefully with a tissue, a thin square of steel with a notch like a feeler gauge. He set it on the desk with his forms, then opened his voice recorder, speaking in that steady tone he used for field notes. He described the room, the safe brand, the tool, and the time on the microwave clock because simple details held steady on lonely days. Mara asked if he knew how to clear the safe code since the master sheet had gone missing during renovations last winter. He did not, but he knew the trick of powering off consumer locks, which could flip hidden defaults, according to a warehouse supervisor he once interviewed. He unplugged the mini fridge, found the breaker panel behind a painting, then asked permission to shut the room briefly. They stood in the doorway while the lights flickered and the highway hummed like a restless air conditioner beyond the lot. He waited 10 seconds, restored power, then tapped the keypad with a ballpoint, feeling silly and a little curious. The safe beeped twice in a lower tone, which he recognized from a training video about apartment lockouts, reportedly used by traveling warranty teams. He tried a factory code that someone had once mumbled during a fire inspection, and the safe chirped, green light winking. The door opened an inch against a sticky seal, and Mara let out a nervous laugh, surprised and worried in equal measure. Inside sat a clear zipper pouch with a folded receipt, a motel keycard from another town, and a small black voice recorder. He found a driver loyalty card attached to the receipt, and he read the printed name softly without repeating it twice. The dates lined up with last week in neat columns, and the purchase list looked like roadside dinners between midnight and 2. He asked Mara if the guest from yesterday had paid cash, and she nodded, then reached for the phone to check archived calls. The front desk handset kept scratchy tapes by default, a habit from the previous owner who never trusted software invoices. She played a call stamped at 2 in the morning, where a tired voice asked for room 12, mentioning a late delivery and stiff back. Another call at 2:30 asked about vending, and a third at 4 asked if nobody would bother him until noon. Lyle switched to evidence mode, careful and methodical, letting his coffee cool while he cataloged the pouch contents. He photographed the safe before moving anything, then called his supervisor to report an unexpected discovery unrelated to the truck claim. The supervisor told him to act reasonably and preserve anything with identifiable information, then to keep his focus on the scheduled inspection. He listened to the voice recorder after asking Mara to stay within earshot, since 2 listeners felt wiser than one on strange mornings. The first file held roadway noise, then a quiet tone of someone rehearsing directions, same room number repeated like a sticky thought. The second file was shorter, a man saying he could not keep doing this and that she would understand once it was delivered safely. He paused to note the words safely, which felt pointed given the open door and the blinking keypad. He bagged the recorder in a zip bag from his kit, then checked the keycard from the other town, which was stamped with a lion logo. Mara recognized the chain and said there was a property 30 miles north, mostly used by truckers and medical travelers. He returned the room to normal and headed for the burned truck with his camera bag, but his plan had started to wobble. The pickup sat behind a towing yard fence, soot clinging thick to the firewall, while melted wires drooped like tired ivy. He worked the usual grid of photos, then the odometer and the cargo bed, then cross-reference with dispatch notes he had requested by email. The fire report smelled like common engine loss, not sabotage, and he felt relief settle along his shoulders as the cause narrowed. He dictated measurements and closed the laptop, then looked at his watch and thought about the safe again and the trembling voice. He felt a nudge of duty that had nothing to do with premiums, and he drove back to the motel through heat that made the road shimmer. Mara met him with a printout of last night guests, which listed an alias that matched the loyalty card name partly. The address field showed a mail drop location, familiar to freight drivers who rolled through without a fixed base. She said a long white tractor had idled near the ice machine last night, according to a neighbor who called about fumes after midnight. He asked for the neighbor number, then listened to a careful woman describe a man in a reflective jacket with a limp. She said he stayed near room 12 door, not inside, as if waiting for someone to arrive quietly or leave quickly. She heard 2 quiet knocks around 3, and a soft voice answered, then a cart rattle like someone moving luggage without wheels. Lyle opened the pouch again and noticed a handwritten code on the receipt back, 4 digits and a messy star next to it. He tried the code on the safe, and the delay light flashed, which often meant an old user lockout or a wrong sequence. He snapped a photo and lowered the door, then rolled the notched tool between his fingers, a weight that felt borrowed from someone patient. He thought about a repairman he had interviewed in 2019 who taught him that thieves love patterns more than courage. The man said patterns live in receipts, tolls, and vending logs, because tired people seek familiar sandwiches and coffee brands. Lyle searched the loyalty program website on his phone, typed the partial name and 4 digits, and got a generic profile with travel points. The profile showed recent redemptions listed by city, and he wrote them on a notepad, then drew lines between dates and approximate routes. The cities formed a loop around distribution centers, with brief pauses near hospitals and bulk pharmacy hubs according to public maps. He felt his heart step faster as the voice recorder line about delivered safely nudged his thoughts toward the quiet side of medicine. He told Mara he would drive north to the Lion Logo Motel for a quick visit, and she insisted on calling ahead politely. The clerk up there skimmed her stay sheets and mentioned a forgotten envelope last week, found under a mattress frame during turnover. The envelope held nothing when housekeeping retrieved it, but a corner showed marks from a rubber band, reportedly stretched tight. He reached the northern property by mid-afternoon, watched trucks rock gently in wind, and asked for the manager on duty. A tall man with tired eyes met him in the lobby, said a nurse had asked about a lost pouch 3 nights ago. She wore a badge from a staffing agency, spoke quickly, and left a number that went to voicemail full by morning. The manager allowed a quick look at the lost and found cabinet, which contained phone chargers, a chipped mug, 3 lanyards, and a plastic bag with an empty pharmacy sticker peeled halfway. Lyle photographed the bag and wrote the former label number carefully, then stepped into the parking lot to call a friend in compliance he trusted. The friend checked a public database of recalls and shortages, then told him to consider the rise in small clinical thefts along transport corridors. He returned to his car and replayed the second audio file, hearing the way the man swallowed hard between sentences. The phrase "delivered safely" stuck again, and he wondered if safely meant to someone specific, not to a warehouse or anonymous shelf. He drove back to the first motel with a plan forming, not quite a theory, but a set of steps that could either untangle or embarrass him. He asked Mara for permission to review last week camera footage that covered the breezeway near room 12, and she agreed. The feed was old, grainy, and stamped with the wrong date, since nobody reset it after storms in 2015. Still, silhouettes moved clearly enough. And at 3:12, a figure in a reflective jacket appeared with a short, careful stride. The figure waited near the door, then crouched to slide something under, then stood fast as another figure approached from the stairwell. The second person carried a rolling cart with a blanket thrown over, which hung low enough to hide a small cooler shape. They exchanged a short handshake, then rolled the cart toward the soda machine area, where cameras always blinked with static. Lyle paused the frame and sketched the handshake position, because small, consistent gestures tied people to habits when faces stayed hidden. He compared the notebook times to the archived calls, matching the neighbor report with the footage minute stamp nearly exactly. He folded his notes and looked at Mara, who watched quietly with the clipboard held like a shield against a sudden chill. He called the non-emergency line and asked to speak with property crimes, then explained he was an adjuster who found items in a room safe. He said the items might connect to an ongoing pattern, not a single incident, and that he was available to hand them over cleanly. The dispatcher thanked him and routed the call, and he kept his voice steady while explaining that nobody was hurt today. The detective who arrived wore a tie gone soft at the edges. A man who had seen this exact motel a dozen times. He took the pouch, the recorder, and copies of the photos, then asked Lyle to explain the breaker trick and the code attempts. He nodded at the handshake frame and said a group had moved product along back roads for months, staying under dollar thresholds on purpose. Lyle asked quietly if product meant medicine, and the detective said people cut solutions with water and resold to small clinics. In some stories, the clinics were victims with forged orders, and in others, they were partners, trying to stretch short supplies like taffy. The man in the reflector jacket likely ran deliveries for cash while hauling legal freight, which made tracing routes messy and confusing. The detective listened to the voice files twice, then looked at the loyalty redemptions and circled 2 cities with his pen. He said the phrase delivered safely could mean to a person at a care home who could not pay official prices anymore. The pouch might have served as a drop signal, and the room safe might have held a stopgap in case someone panicked. They took statements from Mara and the neighbor by phone, and the manager at the northern property sent a scanned copy of his notes. The detective collected the notch tool and said it was standard for bypassing cam locks, which matched a series of quiet thefts from vending. He asked Lyle to write a formal summary of his steps, meticulous and dated, and to expect a follow-up if a warrant landed later. Lyle finished the paper part in his room, breathing slow while light crept through the blinds in a warm, tired stripe. He wrote down the way the safe beeped twice after power restoration, which suggested a default that any one patient could eventually find. He wrote the route loop and the hospital adjacency, and he wrote the voice phrasing exactly because transcription mattered when memories warped. He closed his laptop and stared at the open safe like it wanted to be ordinary again, silent and blank and light. He felt that shift people talk about when routine work bends into something it has no business touching on a weekday. He thought about honest clinics, rationing doses, then about someone paying cash at 3 in the morning because a parent cried. At dusk, the detective called back and said a unit found the white tractor idling near a different budget property downtown. The driver had the same chain lanyard from the lost and found cabinet, and his phone contained notes about room safes by brand. He reportedly told officers he was only a messenger and that someone else handled actual swapping and dilution, which sounded flat and practiced. Lyle listened quietly and said he would be available if a deposition request arrived. Then he sat with the keycard on the dresser. He knew he would remember the feel of that notched tool because it had a purpose-built patience that felt personal. He knew he would remember the cheap beep of the safe and the way a single small space changed the line of his day. A week later, he got an email from the detective, brief and measured, thanking him for the timeline and the careful photos. The message said the pouch had traces of saline and a label adhesive compound common to medical packaging of a certain class. The voice on the recorder matched a man pulled over near a way station, according to dispatch logs and an archived booking photo. Lyle drove back to the motel after closing another case, and he asked Mara how business felt since the long Tuesday. She said people still stopped for highway rest, and she tightened a few procedures quietly, preferring to let small changes speak. She now kept master codes in a locked drawer and replaced 3 aging safes with models that logged attempts for a full week. They stood in room 12 a moment, like visitors paying respects to an inanimate witness that never blinked. The safe sat closed and calm, doing exactly what a box was meant to do, which felt both reassuring and strange. He signed the receipt for his stay, then shook her hand, and promised to bring better stories next time through. On the drive home, he thought about the phrase delivered safely again and how words can hide more than they reveal. He wondered how many small transactions keep the world running, good and bad, unremarkable and decisive, stacked behind quiet doors. He decided the safe had not made him heroic or special, it had only reminded him that dull edges can cut when pressure builds. He kept working claims, taking pictures of bent bumpers and damp carpet, writing notes with careful times and plain language. He still believed that truth likes details and that details prefer patient notebooks, not flashy speeches or clever hunches. When he thought about that Tuesday, he did not think about danger or chase lights. He thought about how a box opened and a day veered left. Mara hired another housekeeper and bought a better cart, one that glided without rattling near cameras and soda machines. She laughed more at the front desk now, but her eyes still checked keys and codes before she turned off the lights. She told her nephew that small routines matter, like counting towels and returning clipboards, because order resists the creep of careless luck. The detective moved on to other cases and sent one last note months later, carefully worded, acknowledging ongoing court schedules. He wrote that the room-safe discovery had clarified timing between suspects, which helped align witness statements with fuel receipts precisely. He added a line about public hearings scheduled for late next spring, where facts would hopefully land on paper clearly. The motel kept renting room 12 to travelers who wanted ground-level convenience and an easy walk to the ice. The safe held wallets and passports and nothing dramatic for a while, which suited everyone whose name stayed off any report. The highway kept pouring itself past the parking lot, and the night clerk kept coffee hot for anyone who needed comfort. Lyle sometimes thought about stopping by without a claim, just to buy a soda and wave at the office through dusty glass. He pictured the safe blinking quietly in that square of afternoon sun, as if practicing for whatever day came next. He accepted that the box had not changed him completely, but it had polished a habit he already valued deeply. He looked back on it like a narrow bridge he crossed safely, not a legend, just a real span over a quiet creek. He had listened, he had written, he had looked twice, and he had taken small steps that lined up neatly. That felt like enough for a life that preferred steady roads to loud headlines, and it still does.